Hello, and welcome to all of you joining us here at the Happiness Festival, hosted by the Happiness Institute at Oxford in association with Going Life and Oxford University Scientific Society. Today we are joined by Robin Ince. Robin is a comedian, author, and science broadcaster. He is probably best known as the co-host of BBC Radio 4's award-winning science podcast, The Infinite Monkey Cage. Welcome, Robin. It's an absolute honour to have you with us here today.
Oh, it's a light. I really enjoy all of these different ways that we have now. Everyone has just upped their ability to communicate across the whole world. I mean, it's been great in terms of like we're doing a new series of Infinite Monkey Cage, and no one's got an alibi, no one's got an excuse not to do it. So suddenly we're able to get 4 astronauts together and that kind of thing because we don't have to get them in the same room. So I love all this kind of stuff. It's great.
No, it's wonderful, and thanks for joining us. We were just having a chat about how long we've been trying to get you on our show. So. Thank you for coming on. For everyone, we'll be having a live Q&A session at the end, so feel free to post your questions for Robin anytime during the discussion, either on the Facebook or YouTube live stream comment sections. For now, I'll hand over to Chris, who'll be leading our interview today. So take it away, Chris.
Hi guys, thank you, Matt.
Hi, Chris.
And, I'd like to start off, Robin, just by talking about how you first became interested in the sciences and why they appealed to you. I know the likes of Carl Sagan, Richard Feynman were big inspirations to you.
Well, I think it's an interesting thing, which, like a lot of people, I was really interested. I had the childish zeal when I was a child to be excited by science. And then I think a lot of us, we hit a wall with sometimes education. Sometimes you find that science becomes detached from the world, this strange thing, which is everything in the world has some, the way that we can understand, it becomes a series of equations. It becomes a series of sums that are separate from your life, from the sky and all those things. So really from about the age of 14 to probably my mid-20s, it wasn't really part of my life. It was, I did... well, the A-levels I did would have been economics, politics, history, Renaissance history, and English. So it was like totally, there was no science there at all. I did an English degree. And then at about the age of 25, I bought a book by a guy called James Randi, who is best known as both a conjurer and a skeptic, one of the leaders of the skeptic movement. And it was all about paranormal investigation and some of the kind of bunkum in there. And that just really interested me. This idea that we are so easily, charlatans can manipulate us and take money off people. And, I find things, the psychic medium world, particularly kind of scurrilous and what that can very often feed off. And that then led me to Carl Sagan's Demon Haunted World, which as a kid, I'd loved Carl Sagan's Cosmos. I would have been 11 years old when that was first on television. It was an amazing experience. And then at the age of 27, Demon Haunted World came out. I read it. And that was really the way that I got back into wanting to know more about why the universe and why we are as we are. And so it was, so there was a period of time where it really was, apart from science fiction movies, that was it. And then bit by bit, I also managed to kind of combat the problem, which I think many people have when they return to science, is how hard it appears to be, because it has a language. Even in popular science, it has a language which is not the language in all the other kind of novels you might be reading or autobiographies or biographies. And then once you go, you don't finish a book and go, now I understand that subject, it's done. You finish a book on quantum mechanics or on the nature of black holes and you go, whoa, there's a lot of things there, aren't there? It's quite confusing, some of those ideas. And I'm a hologram, and the nature of time, it's not one certain, there's a block universe. And once you realize you're in for a long period of confusion with moments of elation and moments of kind of joyful understanding, once you can take that on board, then you're going to stay on the ride, I think.
So obviously, then you went into comedy, and that was your profession. Where did the worlds of science and comedy first collide for you?
Well, it was, I'd been reading science for a while, and I remember one of the stand-up shows I did had a lot more kind of stuff about skepticism and certain bits of it. One of the things that happened was the first show that I did in any of those themes was predominantly kind of skeptical. And then I thought, well, that's easy. It's very easy to mock people, and sometimes you're mocking the wrong people. You're not mocking the manipulators, you're mocking the manipulated, and you have to be careful on that. And I thought, well, actually the more fun thing is, can I turn some of these scientific ideas I'm reading about into stand-up? And one of the things you have to do is, if you're trying to turn something into stand-up and get to a punchline, you have to have some level of understanding of what the idea is, or the punchline doesn't work. And, the first few science jokes I did, I kind of would have hands up from PhDs and professors and various others saying, I'm afraid you haven't entirely understood what Schrodinger was attempting to express with this particular idea. And then I used to do a show called The Book Club, which was a variety show, which mixed up lots of, I used to read from strange novels about giant killer crabs with an accordion backing. And then I'd have all manner of kind of puppeteers coming on and opera singers and sketch troupes. And after a while, I thought, well, it's great doing a variety show that's just silly, but I wonder if I can create a variety show which is about scientific ideas. I wonder if there are so many people like me who gave up on science and felt that they did not have the minds that were required. And maybe if I sneak in a scientist amongst the musicians and amongst the, jugglers or whatever it might be, if I start sneaking in a theoretical physicist every now and again, then I just build on that. So that was it, really. It was about 15, 16 years ago where I started to put on shows where I'd ring up a scientist or get in contact with someone and say, hey, Ben Goldacre was one of the first, actually. Ben Goldacre, I said, hey, Ben, we'd met for some other reason. I said, do you want to come and do a 10-minute set just about epidemiology or whatever? And he was like, yeah. And then he did about an hour-long set. And since then, I've learned that about, there's a fascinating thing. Scientists who, of course, many of them do understand that the nature of time is possibly an illusion, definitely declare it's an illusion when you say it's a tight 10. They do an hour, and you're kind of waving, and they presume the waving is just some kind of trick of the imagination as well. So Ben and then Simon Singh, and then I did a couple of things with Brian Cox, and then people like Helen Chersky, who I work with a lot as well, and Alice Roberts, and all of those different people. And it was just kind of built and built. And then I did it about 12 or 13 years ago. I put on a show at the Hammersmith Apollo. I'm sorry, I'm giving you very long answers. You probably don't need answers this long. I'm giving you too much there. We'll stop there.
Well, I imagine these two worlds are, they're very distinct and different worlds, science and comedy. When, in comedy where you're surrounded by extroverted people, and the science world where you're often stuck in a dark, dusty corner of some long forgotten lab, twiddling dials or refrigerating sort of questionable liquids. But do the personalities of these worlds share any similarities, and what can they learn from each other?
Oh, I think there's a huge similarity. I mean, I've described in the past the fact I think a lot of comics are what I would consider to be extremely lazy scientists. They're fascinated by ideas, but there's no way they're going to sit for 5 years, 10 years, 50 years trying to work out. Once they've got to the pun of that idea, that might be enough for them. So I think that the curiosity is very shared. All the stand-ups that I hang around with are people with full bookshelves, always talking about different weird films and documentaries they've seen. And I often find in the green room, there's a beautiful thing when you talk about the kind of, the dusty, solitary nature of scientists. I love the fact that Cheltenham Science Festival, that when that was in the early days, the hotel where they used for the scientists and the jazz musicians, when there's a jazz festival, they wouldn't give the science festival the same budget price as jazz and classical music, because there's no way that the bar takings would be as big. Jazz musicians big. Of course, what they found out immediately is once you release scientists from their dusty corners with their questionable liquids, they go, brilliant! These are not questionable liquids. We know exactly. And everyone was drinking and gregarious. And I find, scientists and comedians really like hanging around together because they've both got questions for each other. I mean, I find Paul Nurse, who's quite brilliant, obviously Nobel Prize winner, and the Crick Institute, all those things. I love hanging around with someone like him because not only does he have this, incredible, the fecundity of his mind is remarkable, but he's someone who can't understand how on earth I could go and do comedy. And I have to try and explain. And he goes, oh my God, the nerves, I don't know how you do it. And I go, but I don't understand. Paul, you've changed the possibilities of human beings. And I love that thing that very often comedians with scientists see all of the, I'm such an imposter, I'm sat with a Nobel Prize winner. And for some reason, scientists feel that they're imposters, even though they've improved and changed the world, because they're sitting with someone who just shows off for a living. So there's lots of really great kind of very happy arguments that come out of it as well.
Yeah, I think that combination of alcohol and curious minds is is a match made in heaven.
Yeah, and it really, I mean, that's one of the faster. I mean, with Paul Nurse, I remember, I think it was one of the British Science Association in Birmingham one year, and I used to talk about this. There was a brilliant moment. We'd been at this event, and Paul and we'd been chatting together and having a few drinks, and then we got to the cab to take us back to the hotel, and Paul couldn't work out how to open the taxi door. And I used to talk about, the joy when you actually find yourself explaining something to a Nobel Prize winner, when you actually go, well, what you need to do, Paul, is the hand needs to go a little bit further under, then it's a lift and then a pull back. And you go, yeah, okay, you understand the way the universe works, but I can open doors.
That's one to tell the grandkids
Yeah.
that. And so one of your shows that you performed in the past was called Happiness Through Science. What did you explore in this?
That was, do you know what? It's so many shows ago, I barely remember. I think that one in particular, that was before I did a show about Darwin after that. And then there was that one was meant to be one of the kind of the bridge shows in terms of saying, here's lots of beautiful ideas that come from the scrutiny and curiosity that the scientific method requires. So there's a lot of I talk very basically about different ideas of kind of quantum mechanics. I talked a little bit about the life of Richard Feynman. Sometimes I put in some stuff about Marie Curie as well. It was a real hodgepodge of loads of different ideas, which were to say that illusion that scientists are this separate breed that go, hello, I've finished counting everything now and I've made a sum. There we are. Thank you very much. We're the artists and we're having a fabulous time using our imagination. So it was about, I think I'm going to misquote Einstein now, where he said from logic you can go from A to B, with imagination you can go wherever you want. But that was part of what it was about. It was about the fact that imagination is a vital part of scientific advance. And I think we're seeing a lot more. Again, I think that's why artists and scientists get on. I think if your drive is not, if it's just the ego, which of course it's not for most people that I read, if it is about the curiosity and the delight, what Constable, the great, British painter Constable, he would talk about the idea that his canvases were experiments. They were experiments of how he was perceiving Salisbury Cathedral or that Haywain or whatever it might be. And so I think, with artists, there is that imagination. Both groups of people are using imagination to go, here is my subjective perception. At what point does it start to become an objective perception? And of course, with art, it never has to be an objective perception. I mean, I realize objective perceptions are ultimately an impossibility, but as we know, with certain areas of physics and science broadly, you can narrow it down to say this is about as objective as we get in terms of understanding. Whereas science, whether it's cubism, minimalism or whatever, you don't have to have an objective result.
How do you think spending time with scientists and comics has grown you differently? Have you gained different things from like the different professions, or?
I probably have, and I probably don't realize what it is quite a lot of the time. I mean, there's my fascination with science, I think it does change the way that I scrutinize things. So I think in one way it does help with stand-up, because stand-up is looking at the world and what is beyond it and going, what can I do with this? How can I turn this into a story? What is the interesting thing? I mean, the one thing that I think it certainly made me in the last 10 years in particular is, for me, one of the vital things about the shows I do is that they have to be interesting as well as entertaining. Now, that's not to dismiss the comedians who just do a series of jokes and create joy. That is fantastic. But I want there to be ideas that people will later on get in contact and go, hey, I saw X to Phoenix. And I was just wondering, right, there was this person you talked about, or this idea. I want to make the idea stickier. So that becomes, when I was first to stand up, but for many years, the most important thing was the laugh. And now I still want it to be funny, but I want it to have something which might change. It's, it is that thing that sometimes when you read a certain book or you see a certain artist, the universe is changed for you when you leave that room or when you put that book down. And it doesn't have to be some great Damascene moment, but it just means that you're looking at the stars, or you're looking at the rain, or you're looking at a reflection, and it's slightly different. You are able to see more in it. I think a lot of it is rooted to the famous Feynman moment, which is where he sits in a chair. He says, "I've got a friend who's an artist," and sometimes he says something I don't agree with too well. He says, "When I see a flower, I see the beauty of a flower, but when you see a flower, you pick it apart and it becomes a dull thing. And I think he's kind of nutty." Now, that whole beautiful monologue where he basically explains that by understanding why a flower is as it is, by understanding its evolution, by understanding its color, by thinking about the aesthetic quality of the flower and about the insects that are drawn to that aesthetic, all of those different things, they do not remove the beauty. I was, can I clang a name drop here? Right. So I was chatting with Steve Martin. Yeah. I've done that. And he was in the first episode of this series of Infinite Monkey Cage, which was such an incredible thing. Of course, Steve Martin is a lover of art, and he is another person who, philosophy and science, he's interested in everything. And he at one point was talking about sometimes he gets to a point in art where if he really understands the painting, if he really believes he's got to a level of understanding the painting and the meaning behind the painting is no longer as beautiful as it was. Now, of course, that doesn't happen in most pieces. Most great pieces of art, you will find your subjective experience. You will never get a... But he said, he found that interesting. There's a couple of pieces where he went, I've lost the beauty of that. And I don't think, to me anyway, from my outsider perspective, that happens with science. I think the more I can see how you can fall out of love with something. I can see that if you have a particular idea, if you think, right, this is what I'm going to work on for my whole life, and eventually you go, I've still got nowhere further with this idea. I can see you will fall out of love with that idea. But I think overall, beauty is never removed by a greater understanding. I think it will always increase. When I look at during the lockdown, I've got a little garden and I was doing exercise every day, and I found myself, I was next to a daffodil, and every single day I took a picture of the daffodil, because the daffodil was sprightly at the beginning because it was spring, and then slowly the daffodil dried and you could see the life leaving it, and then people on Instagram became incredibly, there was an emotional attachment to the daffodil. You haven't put a picture up of the daffodil. How's the daffodil? And watching the process of that daffodil's decline and having some understanding of the nature of the seasons and how the reproduction of flowers made that process even more beautiful than had it merely been the beauty of a daffodil alone.
Yeah, I think I completely agree. I think looking into the minutiae of nature is one of the great joys that I think we can all attest to. And I imagine you spent your fair share of time traveling the globe. How does humor and comedy differ between cultures? Does your particular comedic flavor translate across to these cultures? I know you rely on a lot of references, and you've got a bouquet of voices that you do. Is there an objective humor that translates into every culture?
I love that I've got a bouquet of voices. That's a beautiful thing. A bouquet of Brian Blesseds. That's one of my favourites, as you know. It's an interesting thing because, of course, that's one of the tools that I will very often lose. When this time, where was I this time last year? This time last year, I think I would have been in Auckland in New Zealand. And if I was talking with Brian Cox today, and we were saying how ridiculous it is that this year, I think actually I did go to Toronto this year and I got as far as Stornoway in Scotland, but that's it. Whereas last year we did, USA, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, Singapore. Overall, there are, as you point out there are cultural divides. There are certain points where you go, well, the most interesting one, because obviously there were certain voices that I knew I can't use that, and I can replace most things with a different kind of character or personality, and it does make you work harder, and that's a lot of fun. It's a horrible moment when you're going through one of what is undoubtedly what you consider to be your best routines, and you then go, oh, I've just realised the punchline is parochial. This will not play in Brisbane. But overall, it's an odd, like in America, in the US anyway, there was a very interesting thing, which I was doing a series of jokes about kind of the development of our brains. in the early stages, 1-year-old, 2-year-old, 3-year-old, 4-year-old, 5-year-old. Each year there was a different step. And it started off before, at the point of birth, and the worry that we have with psychology now, that when you have a child, how quickly you start to worry. Oh my God, what's the one thing I'm going to do that's going to be the one thing that's the wrong thing that means that my child's going to grow up to be a mass murdering serial killer? And I have this whole routine about that. Now, the first night, I think it was in Wilmslow in the US, I did that bit, and it got a laugh, but man, it was a different laugh. It was a much more, and very quickly I worked out why in the US that's not as good. And the reason is, and this is very bleak, the reason is the number of mass murdering serial killers, the number of, sometimes week by week, there is another school shooting. And so what was absurd when I was in Peterborough or in Glasgow becomes something which is actually real. So that was an interest. Sometimes it's those things. It's a very different cultural thing to merely a reference point to a musician or a TV personality. It's actually about, so that was overall what was surprising was how little we needed to change. I changed a lot of the stand-up just because I'd done a similar versions for 18 days or so in the UK, and I thought it would be fun to do something different. I like to change it as much as possible, and certainly Brian and I, a lot of the stuff we do together is improvised, and that's fun. But there was also another interesting change, which was at the end of the last show that we did. We'd been talking about the nature of time, and I came on and I did a poem about the moment that when you're playing with your child and you're building a den with them, and you're wondering if this will be the last time you build a den with them, because they're not going to want to build dens anymore. And you're talking about the difference in the fact that time for children is that big, and time when you're middle-aged is that big, and it gets smaller and smaller. And then Brian would come on right at the end, and he would talk about the fact that the very laws that mandate there must be life in the universe are the same laws that mandate our lives must be finite. For there to be life to exist, there must be death as well. And in the UK, there was lots of nice discussions afterwards and stuff. But in the US, that and much more so than Canada as well, that border is very specific there. That hit much harder, not in a negative way. It's not like we have people with placards outside from kind of crazy fundamentalist sects or anything like that. But you could see that in a culture where I feel certainly in terms of an English-speaking culture, there is a level of mysticism that is a lot more than you see in Australia or Canada or in the UK. And, a lot of the people we work with, they might not have religion, but they would kind of go, but ghosts, I mean, is it really true they break the second or third dynamics? Because I kind of want to believe that. There did seem to be within that culture, I felt, a greater predilection for beliefs which verge on the kind of mystic. And so that point of talking about death it felt a lot more potent. It felt like a much greater philosophical, it felt, in Brighton, it felt like people going, oh yeah. Yeah. Whereas in, places in Wisconsin, it was like, whoa, oh. And you could see the way that they left. The pause at the end as the lights went out, there was a different sense of, oh. And that's really intriguing to me.
Something that I've wondered for a while. Obviously, you as a comic, you get up, you stand in front of people. The goal is to make people laugh. You mentioned there when you don't get a laugh. When I'm watching and that happens, if I'm at a comedy gig and they say a punchline to a joke and there's no laugh, I feel like a part of my soul. Do the comics on the stage get that feeling, or is it something that you just get used to over time?
No, you must never get used to that. I don't think. I think, it's an interesting thing that some comics, a bit like the old music hall days, they get a very solid set and they may well not change it for years. And we've all had periods of time like that when you're working the clubs in the early days, you're so worried about your next booking that sometimes you think, I'm going to stick with that. I'm going to stick with that routine. It works. And then you might find yourself a decade later going, I'm still sticking with that routine. I must try something else. And I can sometimes find for those comics, there's a kind of rhythm and they go, nah, it didn't work tonight. But for most comics that I know, you must, if you start just going, I can deal with, I'm fine with that, you're going to stop creating. You have to, that moment, that confrontation. Sorry, I'm dropping the mic there. I should have picked a wider book. I picked H.P. Lovecraft, which is not merely a book that's not wide enough for my microphone, but on top of that, it also does have mysticism, demons, and of course Cthulhu. So that was a very dangerous book to. That's the Necronomicon about to open up. But it's no, I'm very rarely satisfied with any gig, even a gig that for any. And I used to have a problem where sometimes after a gig, I would put things on social media going, I'm really, hey Plymouth, that wasn't a great gig, and and I get all these people going, what are you talking about? We had a great time. I don't know what, and I'd realise it's something that a friend of mine, Philippa Perry, who's a wonderful therapist, when I was interviewing her a few years ago for a book that I was doing, she said the problem with being human is we judge everyone else from the exterior and we judge ourselves from the interior, and so that means quite often at a gig, all you are seeing is imperfections. All you can find between the big laughs, you notice that fault, and you wonder if that person there is being a bit twitchy, they're a little bit bored, and that person there's coughed. Have they got a tickly cough? Or they've noticed their throats there. But all of that. There's a lot of voices in your head during that thing, and I will work as hard as I can. I never want an audience. They might end up going, do you know what? That wasn't my thing. But I would never want to go, and he didn't put much into it. I will put everything that I can think of to think I want to make, especially when I think of the fact that people have spent money, they've come to see me, and so I want to make sure that even if they're unimpressed, they notice the sweat. I'm
going to make sure I laugh at every single joke at every comedy gig I go to.
No, don't do that, because that'll give us a false sense of security. We'll storm Oxford, and then, of course, once we only have to go as far as Didcot, the people haven't moved on with us. The Didcot audience, we go, Oxford was having us on. It's an important thing as well. It's a very Barry Cryer, the great comedian who's 60 years now, probably over 60 years he's performing, and he said once in his 50s he used to do a double act with a wonderful comedian called Willie Rushton, and one night Willie Rushton said to him, Barry, you've fallen out of love with the jokes, and he realised what he meant. Willie Rushton could tell that he was just doing the jokes. And it always has to be more than that. It has to be, to me, part of a procession almost. When you go on, I was interested. I was watching Nick Cave the other night. Nick Cave's one of my favourite performers of all time. He's absolutely remarkable lyricist and performer, all things. And I was surprised to hear him say, I'm nervous beforehand. I think, how am I going to have the energy? And why is anyone listening? He was saying all these things. You think, not you, though. And when you actually find out that almost every performer that you like, if they aren't experiencing some form of nervousness, of fear, of heightened senses, if they're not experiencing that, I wonder how much that they love it in the first place.
So the dissemination of science and the scientific knowledge to the public via the medium of TV, of radio, has until quite recently quite restricted to fairly serious factual documentaries, where now you can sort of actually have a laugh whilst learning about physics of black holes or the metabolic pathways of an earthworm, as listening to your podcast, The Infinite Monkey Cage. How has the role of science communication evolved over time that you've been working in the industry?
Well, I think it's a weird thing that Infinite Monkey Cage, because we've been doing it for so long, 120 whatever episodes, sometimes Brian and me, we forget that it's still quite an unusual thing, still quite an unusual way of dealing with science. And when we first started it, there were some reviewers who were very sniffy and snotty with us, because they had got, science is presented like this. Hello, welcome to science. Today, we're looking at the planet Saturn, and that's it. Everything has to be dealt with a level. I mean, for instance, when we did the show that we've just recorded with 4 astronauts, we had Helen Sharman and Nicole Stott and Rusty Schweikart and Chris Hadfield. We were all quite jokey as well. It was quite informal, and I think I've found that sometimes doing gigs with astronauts. I know, what a weird thing, doing gigs with astronauts. So much fun. That they're so used to people going, now you've been to the moon. This must have been the most amazing. No one treats them as human beings. And I think that was one of the things that we always wanted to do with Monkey Cage, was scientists are people with passions and interests and senses of humor, and we don't want to just say, tell us about your wonderful work with your strange brain. We wanted to, the whole thing, the humanizing of it was a very important part. And I think I've seen more and more of that, and it's such a joy. Sometimes when you get a certain guest on, again, actually, the first time we did Monkey Cage in America, I think some of the scientists were slightly thrown by the fact that we were not doing proper science communication. We were chatting about dinosaurs and chatting about extraterrestrial intelligence and its possibilities and all those things. We were having a conversation which may go off on many tangents. I mean, that's one of the things that the joys of working with all these people is, when Brian and I sit down beforehand with our producer Sash and we kind of scribble down, right, this is probably we normally try and have in each show 3 places that we're going to go. We very rarely get past question 2 because someone answers and you go, and that I think is also part of my favorite interviewers to watch. Are when you know that they are reactive. They're not just going, we've spent 2 weeks working out all the questions we're going to ask this person. When you see that joy of hey, hang on, you've just told me an idea that's blown my mind and I want to explore that more. So that's that's a very important part of it for us, which is we may well fail to achieve what was written up on the board, our imaginary board of this is the journey of the show. And it's also, that's one of the reasons I think is we never want to deliver to people a module that they can just take away and say, oh, good, I know about that subject now. What we hope we deliver are enough interesting ideas that people go, I must go to the library immediately. I must go to the internet. I must look this up. I must see this person's YouTube film. I must find out. That's what we want them to be excited to go on, further journeys with these ideas.
I think the beauty of it, or especially for me, it's indistinguishable from just sitting around with your mates and chatting about these sort of things. That's what it comes across as a show, rather than, like you said, a very structured scientific program. It's a chat amongst friends about some really interesting topics, which is why I love it so much.
I'm glad you find that, because that's really what we want it to be. And it's and I mean, this series in particular, I've got to admit, and it's been interesting because, of course, we've not been together. Every one of us has been in a different room, in a different basement, in a different attic, whatever. And it's been very interesting to see. I think one way is because people have got so used to very quickly using this form of technology. And it has a level of informality that I don't. The one that we did about space archaeology the other day and about evolution with Alice Roberts and Sarah Parkak and Sarah Pascoe, that they're always, all those people are fantastic minds and tremendously fun to work with. But I think we went even further and even stranger because we were so relaxed. Because you've just come out of your kitchen, you've got a cup of tea, ping, hello, oh yeah, we'll just start recording in a minute, and off you go. And then we have this fascinating thing, which is because of the wonderful use of technology, where we now have an audience, which is 200 people, all of whom are each sat on their own in there, and they're there going like that, and somehow it all comes together, and we hear an audience, and apparently that's what But that I love. I mean, this is one of the things that I've found, again, looking for the positives in something which is a negative thing, such as a pandemic and the situation that's been going on and the lives that have been lost that were unneeded. You have to also go, what can we find that we can take away from this? And I think one is the desire for people to connect. The hunger for people to go, let's find a way of making sure that some people who might be alone and some people left out are not left alone. I think that and the other thing that I found fascinating with this thing is because we've had such a reduced landscape to look at, I think, like that exercise daffodil I was mentioning, people have really been focusing on smaller squares of the sky, squares of their community, whatever. And I think that has absolutely nothing to do with the question you asked. Very clearly. As I said, tangential is one of my hobbies.
As you mentioned before, you've done well over 100 episodes of Infinite Monkey Cage now. I think, are you on your 22nd season?
Yeah, 22nd series. Nearly the end of that, yeah.
So you've met your fair share of scientists and academics. I think that's fair to say. What do you think gets them most excited, and why do they enjoy what they do?
I think it's the hoped for revelation. And it's the fact that not only when you get, I mean, one of the beauties, I think, of revelations, using the scientific method, is a revelation is never a conclusion as well. When you look at that beautiful moment where you see Peter Higgs sat in an auditorium, seeing the results that have come from the Large Hadron Collider, and he sees that his idea 50 years before was a good idea. And what is beautiful about that is, yes, it goes, Peter, you're right, but it doesn't then go, shut down all the colliders now, we're done, we've found it out. From that grow all of these other questions. So I think that's part of the thing that I've seen as everyone that I work with, pretty much with very rare exceptions, is excited and excitable. And is filled with, when we sit in the green room before a show happens, it's never quiet. Everyone has always got, we're not going to talk about this in the show tonight, but there was something that I read that you wrote. I think it was a paper that you did. Everyone has questions. And that goes the other way to, with the comedians on, there'll be someone who go, I saw the routine that you did, and there was something you did. I think I saw it at the Oxford Playhouse, you did. Everyone wants to share ideas, and everyone wants, very rarely do you get grandstanding. Very rarely do you get someone delivering a monologue, which is merely a moment of self-aggrandizing. Everyone wants to take something else from someone else's mind. Everyone else wants to know what's in there and go, oh, that's the thing that I wanted to know more about. So I think it is that what I've always, the more that I learn about science and the more that I learn about humanity, I think is the beautiful thing, which is there is no conclusion. In the same way that I talk a lot with a wonderful cosmologist called Carlos Frank. I don't know if you know Carlos, he's based up in Durham. And during lockdown, quite often on a Wednesday, we just kind of meet up between 5 and 6:30. We meet up over Zoom and we have a chat. And we were talking the other day about the fact that people do want definites. People want consciousness. What is consciousness? Now, whatever the answer eventually is to what is consciousness, I think people will be very disappointed, because what they actually want, I think very often, is an answer that is magic somehow or other. And it won't be that. When we eventually, if we do find that there's that consciousness as a whole is something that can be summarized in a series of equations, at that point, there will then be loads more questions. In the same way, if we ever manage to work out what happened into that first 10 to the minus 43 of a second of the beginning of the universe, it will not be a conclusion. I do not believe we'll then be able to go, oh, that's the beginning of the universe, everything else is sorted. You will find on that timeline, there is now a new timeline that is required, or a new lack of timeline that is required. If we ever manage to pinpoint the first, where life itself begins, the transition from inanimate to animate, that will not be the final answer. So I think that is one of the things that I see collectively amongst a lot of the people I work with, which is, we know that we will die ignorant. We know we will die with more things to know. And that, to me, is a far more exciting proposition than being given a series of rules where you go, and this is everything about the universe. That's it. And here's your meaning. Your meaning is this. Is it? Yeah, we did a pamphlet on your meaning. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you must have heard of, in the green room where you're discussing ideas, you must have heard so many fantastic ideas from so many, brilliant minds. If you had unlimited funds and resources, do you have like a particular area of research that you would allocate these to? Like, what excites you most in the field at the moment?
It's really hard. Do you know what? It changes almost weekly, because you read a new idea and it becomes so, like, consciousness, for instance, is not in that. I'm not, I did a lot of reading around this, and I eventually found it to be a problem that I found slightly boring. It's a problem that I was much more excited by what we were able to do with our consciousness than it felt to me like, let's not waste time. It feels almost narcissistic. What we should mainly work on is, no, let's move. I do find that idea of what happens within a black hole. I do find that idea of, if we do end up only being able to see, here is this almost two-dimensional surface at the event horizon. I find that idea of two-dimensionality from information projected from another place, I find that utterly fascinating. I find the idea of the block universe, I find the idea that time is a block, and that we have this strange personal experience which has a beginning, a middle, and an end and all that, but that is in some ways a delusion stroke illusion. I find that very, very fascinating. So those kind of things are, I mean, there's lots of other things, multiverse and many worlds, others, but I do find in particular understanding of time, and both from the perspective of a black hole, to find out our understanding of how the universe ends or doesn't end or what is left, I find that an incredible thing. So there's no one thing that I would like the greater the technology to look further and further out to the universe is, whatever. And I know there's going to be a limit. I know there's a point where you go, this is as far as we can look. But for me, one of the most exciting things is looking at, when you look at the cosmic microwave background radiation and you look at those tiny, tiny differences in heat, tiny, and you realize that all of those different, that tiny difference in heat is a huge amount of what is now matter and planets and us and blackberries and the rings of Saturn, all that. I find that is that to me is I suppose quite close to what is sometimes considered to be a religious experience, to be able to look that far back and see that level. It is that's the scan that's going, and there is the pregnant person, and there they are having a scan, and this is what you see in the scan. That to me is a really amazing thing.
Yeah, I was expecting you would say to research how Brian Cox keeps his hairline, but that was
I know how he keeps them. I can never tell.
And finally, what does happiness mean to you?
Yeah, it's a weird. Sometimes it is just staring at the sky. I was talking the other week with doing some event when we still kind of did outside events, that there is. I mean, my ultimate happiness thing is playing crazy golf with my son in a seaside town after going to a good bookshop and knowing that there's an ice cream store we're going to go to afterwards. That is a very, we are both huge fans of crazy golf. We go to Hastings a lot. There's 3 different courses there. That's one of the, and there is that happiness, which is an experience which is barely experienced. That moment where you have just, and it might be you lying on the grass and you're looking at Venus, and you're seeing more and more of the stars, kind of as though the more you stare, as the more light, kind of the sky becomes more populated in your mind. And there is that moment where you go, I think I had a transcendent moment, and by observing it, it disappears, of course. But that is a very joyous moment where you go, the sensation goes by the observation of it, but that something magnificent and delightful has happened.
Well, that's an incredible answer, and thank you so much. I think my time for questions is up, so I'll open up.
Thank you.
Thank you, and I'll pass over to Matt.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Chris. That's great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Robin. That was really, really entertaining, and enjoyed what you had to say. We've got lots of questions from our audience, so I'll kick off with a question from Madison Parker, which we had to tweak slightly because you addressed the first part of her question during the talk. But can you educate people about science and rationality using humour, especially across cultures?
Yeah, I think you can. I mean, I think one of the things that we know is that if someone laughs with you, their mind immediately becomes more ready to receive ideas. So that bit, I mean, with what we do with Monkey Cages, I'd like to say I play the idiot, but it may well be a part that I play 24 hours a day. And a lot of I think, if the function when Brian and I are doing live shows is, one, for me to humanize him by being a little bit rude, being this strange little bald man being rude to the beautiful physicist, and also saying to people, do not worry if I don't understand it all. There's a huge number of things that, a lot of what I've played with on stage is playing with that idea of how difficult certain ideas are, but it doesn't mean they shouldn't be attractive to you. And I think that combination of someone who does have Brian is really remarkable at his ability. When we do the Q&As, and he I never show them the questions beforehand. They've been tweeted in normally, 12,000 people, and I just throw things and there was one about a slinky once, which was the most fun. I think we were out in Sydney, and both of us were working together on trying to work out something that neither of us in any way knew, and it was a really, and the joy of watching that. But then there's a lovely thing, which is one of my favourite bits, is sometimes Brian will get a question, you go, oh, I don't know. And then I'll look at the audience and go, oh, thank heavens, he doesn't know. There's a thing he doesn't know. So I think all of it is about being, it's to show that it's play. A lot of science, a lot of any form of understanding, whether it's, philosophical or whatever it might be, is it should be about play, that you're toying with things. This is one of the reasons that I'm, hugely admire my friend Alan Moore, who, wrote League of Extraordinary Gentlemen and Watchmen and V for Vendetta and all those things. Alan loves playing with ideas. So when you read some of his comic books, Tom Strong comic books and things like that, he is playing with scientific ideas. And sometimes, we had a great one once where Brian Greene was on as well, and I highly recommend Brian Greene's new book, Until the End of Time. It's a great book. And Alan was sitting there going, well, in one of the stories where I had a planet so massive that it was bending time, and I do realise that some people might not. And then every time he would say something which he'd been very playful with and he believed entirely misrepresented the science, Brian Greene would go, no, that would be scientifically accurate. And then Alan was just sitting there going, I'd never realised what a genius I was, but it's kind of, so I think, yes, a lot of it is about telling people it is play. Play is part of, there is a point you have to refine. And there is a point, obviously, where it has to become a paper or whatever. But a lot of those papers come from playfulness.
Cool. Thanks. Joanna Shirabuki asks, do you have any tips on how to get over the fear of public speaking? We sort of touched on that again in the talk.
Yeah, well, no, it is very hard, though, actually, because I forget sometimes, because even though before most gigs, I will find some way of being nervous. Sometimes it's nothing to do with the anxiety performance. It's that kind of thing that just before you go on, especially at a big gig, I know what I'm doing, but then I suddenly think, what if I suddenly need the loo the moment I get on there? What if I walk on, there's 12,000 people, and I go, I'm so sorry, Brian, I've got to go. I need it. All of you will always find a way of being anxious. And eventually I think you will. I used to, when I was a teenager, I remember at a school debate once, I just went off on one. And I did this rambling tangential routine. I got loads of laughs. And that was really the starting point of being able to publicly speak. But all the way through, I had one knee that was just going, just that was where all the shaking was. So you'll never, the idea of getting over it will never happen, but you have to, you have to know that you really want to express those ideas. So make sure if you want to public speak, just think, I really want to share these. And more often than not, if, don't worry about laughs, don't worry about any of those things. You're the first few times you may well stumble, or you may well be brilliant for the first 5 times and then you stumble. There's no continuum necessarily. But to know that nearly everyone you have ever watched on stage is beforehand. I wanted to do a project once where we took a photo of a performer just before they went on stage and a photo the moment they got to the microphone, because the difference in the is huge. There is something there is a physical reaction. There is so much going on with your adrenaline, with the dopamine, all of those things. So the thing to know is be aware that everyone is scared. Very few people walk on stage without inside, but you don't see that. So you think, and again, that bit I mentioned before about the outside and the inside is a very important part for all of us in our life. It's very often when we sometimes keep things hidden, things that we should share. Sometimes, I'm talking there perhaps about different things in mental health as well, is once you are able to sometimes with your friends admit to something that you believed was strange and only your feeling, you will more often than not find out that it is shared by many people. And that is one of the joys of the kind of stand-up that I'm involved with now, is sometimes you talk about an idea on stage and you've made something ridiculous that may well have come from an anxiety or another kind of, the number of people who go, I really thought it was, I used to talk about this when I was promoting my book a while ago, where one night where afterwards a man came up to the bar and went, I'm a bit annoyed with you. And I went, oh, sorry, what have I done? He went, well, I've spent my whole life believing I'm quite weird, but I've just sat and watched your show with your audience and I've realised we're all bloody weird, which means I'm quite normal, which is disappointing. Now, that moment was that's one of the things that drives me on, is also that I realise that a lot of people in my audience may well have some sense that they're on the outside. And that bit of saying, don't worry, there's a lot of us here. In fact, there's so many that we might be on the inside, actually.
Very true. Okay, our next question comes from Christina A, who's looking for a bit of inspiration. She says, I'm currently a DPhil student in physical chemistry, and I find that it's very difficult to communicate the beauty of chemistry in the world. Do you have any suggestions for a budding science communicator?
What I would say is it's very easy, and I've done this as a stand-up as well. It's and I still do it. I make far too many notes. I think I'm going to talk about far too many ideas. What I would say is think of one idea that you find particularly beautiful. And it might be an idea that you think there's only a minute in it, and you're probably wrong about, I mean, you might not think that, but if you can think of, and especially for science communication, if you can think of one image as well that you can connect to that one beautiful idea, and just think of all the different ways that you can explore, and I mean as small an idea as possible, because if you can think of one thing in your discipline that you particularly love, I think that is, to use the old Carl Sagan thing about when people said to Carl Sagan, why do you want to communicate science? He said, because when you're in love, you want to tell the whole world. And I think that's a very important thing to remember in science communication, is if you start from love. Don't start from any idea about how you want to educate people, anything like that. Start from an idea that you like. People now I imagine it's just, they make a Spotify playlist. But, when I was growing up, it was a cassette, and you would give a cassette to the first time you went out with someone going, these are the bands I really like. Hope you really like these bands too. And you're really hoping they love those ideas too. And that's what you want to do with your science talk, is you want to have the equivalent of that song that you love, and you want everyone else to love that song as well.
Great. Next question comes from John Lucy. He asks, hi Robin, any plans to do extended live video talks such as this for the Infinite Monkey Cage production, given the restrictions that are currently in place for the foreseeable future?
Well, we would, at the moment, we were going to try and actually record this version so that people could actually see visually what we were doing. But for the time being, for various different kind of, I think, legal reasons and stuff like that, we're not able to. But we will be doing, it looks now like the series that's going out at the moment will be hopefully 9 rather than just 6 episodes. We want to extend it as much as possible. And so, Though we're not able, and Brian and I as well, and other friends of mine, I do a Sunday science Q&A every Sunday with Helen Chersky and various different guests. We had Susie Imber recently on, and Brian Cox did it, and Brian Green, and Sarah Parkak, and I'll get Jana Levin on soon. So every Sunday I do a thing not dissimilar to this, in which we take live questions from people and do an hour and a half. But with Monkey Cage, for the time being, I'm afraid you will have to make do with what we're creating. But we, as I said, hopefully a series of 9. We've got nearly 6 done. The first 3 are out. And one of my favourites is the one that's out at the moment, which was Sarah Parkak and Sarah Pascoe and Alice Roberts talking about space archaeology, which was so much fun. And next week's, the one with the 4 astronauts, was just so much a joy. So we will keep making things. And I will certainly, even when Monkey Cage ends, there will be, I think, with Cosmic Shambles, who I do with my mate Trent, we make all this stuff. And we are generally making 5 or 6 or 7 shows a week with different people, sometimes about science, sometimes about art and culture. Next week I'll be doing another of my kind of talks, which has a little bit more about psychology and mental health. I'm a joke on Thursday. And in fact, I should mention, if it's okay for me to say this, immediately after this at 7:30 on Cosmic Shambles, we are doing a COVID-19 panel with 3 people, immunologists and mathematical modelers, talking about that, which is again a live Q&A thing. So certainly I like making as much stuff as possible. I love the fact we can communicate with people in different hemispheres and different time zones, and we all gather together.
Yeah, wonderful. Keep making stuff. That's our motto. Next one is Jason Carasares says, what has been the most difficult scientific concept for you to translate into comedy, or for you to communicate to a lay audience?
That is, do you know what? It's very, I would actually say sometimes it is, and this is going to seem like such a cliche, but quantum theory, after a while, you realize you're very, very surface on the jokes. You're very talking about wave particle duality. There's a certain number of cat jokes you can get away with, a certain number of ways you can kind of anthropomorphize a particle. I think, the next one, I've been mentioning black holes, and that's what I'm working on at the moment, is trying to come up. And I think that is, once you've done a certain amount of reading, you think you're able to translate more information as jokes than you actually are. So I think always the hardest thing is, how quickly can you give an audience enough information for them then to realize that the punchline is some kind of twist? Because punchlines are, moments of the unexpected. And if you're not careful, you realize either you've got a 15-minute setup to a joke, which is far too long, or your joke is ultimately unsatisfactory. So I think the next one, I basically talk about what I'm dealing with in the present, and that is going to be talking about holographic principle, and then different ideas of what lies beyond the event horizon, and that's not proving to immediately reward with punchlines that will live on in perpetuity.
Hannah Sinclair says, as a female scientist, I wonder why there's a paucity of great female science communicators. Will you ever consider working with one?
Oh yeah, no, there's loads. I mean, as I said, in fact, the last show that we did was Sarah Parkak and Alice Roberts, and I work with Helen Chersky every single week on the Sunday Science Q&A. And I think what we have seen is a remarkable change in. I mean, like everything, the problem with so much. And so many cultural problems we have, and of course what we're watching happen at the moment, is it's very easy for someone in my position as, you know, a middle-class white male to not realise that almost from the moment I was born, I had permission to go into certain areas. I had permission, whereas, you know, in science, it used to be much harder in the early days of Monkey Cage to be able to, you know, we try as much as possible to, in the overall in the series, get parity between male and female scientists. You know, sometimes there will be a show which is all female scientists. As much as possible, we try never to have one which is all male scientists, because that is the way things are too often. And very rarely, I think, in the last few series has that happened. Certainly, I can't think immediately of a time like that. In the sort of like the astronaut show, you know, it was important for us to try and make sure it wasn't going to be all male astronauts. So that's why we had Chris Hadfield and we had Rusty Schweikart, but we also had Nicole Stott and we also had Helen Sharman. So yes, the answer is yes, and I think what we're seeing is there's a few people who really pushed ahead and did not stop and had tremendous tenacity. And now that you have people more and more, and I hope we see this increasing in the public sphere, it means that people can say, oh, I am allowed to do that too. And that's what often gets forgotten. If you are in a position of privilege, what you don't realize is that's why when people get annoyed about going, oh, well, this Star Wars, the reason that they've got this kind of cast is only, but you know what? Part of it is also just to say, why can't girls grow up and say, I can be that particular superhero? I know they're not superheroes in Star Wars. I'm not really that au fait, to be honest. I don't concentrate when I take my son to see them. But you know, all of those things, or John Boyega, all of those things are saying, I can be the hero. I can be center stage. So I think it's important. I agree with it. It's very, very important that we try as much as possible, you know, as been talked about, I'm sure, many times before. If you find yourself asked to do a panel at a conference and you find out that it is all white men, then sometimes you have to go, do you know what? I'm going to stand down, and could you find someone else, someone from who is not of my stereotypical background? I think, you know, and we have to try and do that more and more.
Thank you. Artish Laya asks, who are your favourite scientists, engineers, philosophers, and science communicators? Maybe just pick one of those, or
wow, man, there's
however you want to play it.
There's so many people that I really. I mean, I mentioned the work of Janna Levin is some of my favourite. Her book, How the Universe Got Its Spots, and Black Hole Blues, and she also wrote a novel as well, which is Einstein's in the title. I've forgotten what it is. No, the Turing Machines. That's the one. I love reading her work, and I thoroughly enjoy talking to her about stuff. Brian, I do love working with. I'm not going to deny that. I think he's absolutely brilliant. I'm in a very fortunate position. You know, I mentioned already Alan Moore. I find philosophically that he is a fascinating man. Where, you know, comic books may well still be considered by some people to be a flippancy, where his work is certainly not flippant. I do love Richard Feynman. I do find that he helped humanize. And another of my favourites is Miriam Rothschild. If you've never seen, there's a beautiful show called a series done by a friend of mine, Chris Sykes, which was called Seven Wonders, where scientists would pick their seven wonders. And Miriam Rothschild did an enormous amount of work on fleas and about the jumper fleas. Incredible, groundbreaking, really important work. And she was just this fascinating person who's there. She's got all these rabbits that she combs the fleas off. Then she gets a bit of chloroform, which doesn't kill the fleas, but just makes them a little bit woozy. So you're trying to make fleas woozy with chloroform. And that was how she measured. And she's one of those people that every time I watch that documentary and every time I read her work, again, the joy of the curiosity and all of that is such an important part of it. But there's a
Absolutely.
huge list. I mean, I could just go to my bookshelf now. There's, and I know that I've missed an enormous number of people off there as well.
Great. And our final question, apologies to the person sending this, your name was in Thai script, so we couldn't pick out quite what it was. But hi, Robin, were there any difficulties when you first started in finding an audience that liked the niche of a comic looking at science? How did you come those difficulties or low points?
Now, the odd thing is, it wasn't. And it was difficult for me to make satisfying shows sometimes. I think the problems were very much in terms of an audience. I mean, this is one of the things that drives me on. And certainly when I was working in TV years ago and very dissatisfied and often finding that it was very cynical, a lot of it was cynical. And I very often found that I felt audiences are tremendously underestimated. I think that people have, and that was one of the main drives behind me starting to do these live shows. And then fortunately that led to Monkey Cage and all the stuff that I've done since then. But I found right from the start, when I first, I mean, the one that I could tell myself telling that story before, but I started doing a Christmas show. And originally it was called 9 Lessons of Carols for Godless People. And the reason it was called that was because I'd been on a panel show, a debate show, and this really awful fundamentalist guy had been going about, you want to ban Christmas? I went, I don't want to ban Christmas. I love Christmas. I think it's a lovely thing. I think celebration's very important and blah, 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 blah. And I got so bored of this kind of negative thing about atheists all just, no, stop enjoying the universe, you're all going to die. It seemed to be like that. So I thought I'll put on a big celebratory Christmas show for people who might not necessarily feel that comfortable in a church. Let's celebrate it with science. And right from the start, like we put on 2 nights at a lovely theatre called the Bloomsbury Theatre, and they just sold out immediately. And there was such demand that I ended up, the very first time I put on one of the science variety shows of that type, we ended up selling out the Hammersmith Apollo, 3,500 people. So I think what I found out very early on was there was a tremendous hunger for people to get something that was beyond what was being fed to them and what had been believed. And I do always stand by that, that idea. There's a lovely thing. I think it was Lord Reith when he was head of the BBC. Lord Reith, are you going to give the people what they want? No, I'm going to give them something much better than that. And again, Alan Moore, I mentioned him again. Alan once said this, a great line, I think. It said, if the audience knew what they wanted, they would be the artist, not the audience. And I think that's an important thing to remember, which is always push it. Like I said, I have made disappointing shows, and I will continue to do that. That's going to happen because one of the things is the more you experiment, the more, if you're pushing things, then sometimes you go, that one didn't work. That was a failure. But in terms of an audience that are out there, I was amazed at how many people wanted something different. And again, as long as you don't patronize them, as long as you, and I love seeing those moments where sometimes scientists have gone on with an experiment that's gone totally wrong. And there's still been the joy of watching the experiment go wrong, of watching the fact that, this is fail again, fail better. So I think overall it's been quite remarkable. And I find it amazing with Monkey Cage now, the number of people when we travel the world, and it's a real joy. When you get an email from someone saying, I listened to it with my 10-year-old son, or when you get an email from a grandmother who listens to it with her daughter and also her grandson, and all of those things, you just think, oh, good. This is useful as well. It's been a lot of fun to do.
It must be a wonderful feeling.
It is. It's very, when it fails, and I never lose. And I tell you something, I still get nervous before every Monkey Cage. The more successful we've been, the more fearful I am that this is going to be the show that's too boring, or that my joke's rubbish, or all of those things. I've never, it's probably the thing that I almost feel the most nervous about for the longest amount of time. When we're working on the next episode and I'm thinking, right, I know we've got brilliant scientists, we've got to make sure it's brilliant. It has, and of course there will still be ones. As yet, I'm a bit worried about tomorrow's that we're recording about the sun, because we've had so much fun with the first 4 that statistically, does that mean tomorrow's has to be rubbish? I don't know.
I'm sure it won't be. But on that note, both Chris and I would like to thank you so much for joining us, Robin, and thanks for sharing your perspectives on happiness in the worlds of science and comedy, particularly in these unprecedented times.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. What a lot of fun it is. I hope people are giving you lots of support with this.
Well, they certainly are.
It's a delight.
It's great to see.
Brilliant.
It's really great
Thanks
to see.
very much.